introduce Tim McGrath.
Well, thanks, Chris, and welcome everybody, and thank you for taking part in this. And I'd like to also give my thanks to Dr. Brigham, my dear friend Lee Arnold, and to Chris, whom you just met, for allowing this opportunity to take place. It's an honor once more to be part of HSP's programming. And I'd like to pass my best to Sarah Heim, Ron Medford, and the team in the library who've been babysitting me for the last 18 years, mostly on Wednesday afternoons and evenings. This presentation will be interrupted twice by 3 documents from the HSP vaults. 2 are remarkable finds. I did not find them. And the third is my favorite document I found at HSP or anywhere else in the 18 years I've been involved with writing books. They're great examples of what our society, what the Historical Society of Pennsylvania has available for anyone, be they academics, genealogists, or just individuals interested in finding more about our collective history and what you can discover and uncover here at HSP. For the past 5 years, we've been living in an age of alt-right, alt-left, and alternative facts. Thinking we know our own facts or history has recently become a matter of opinion. We know in history that is rarely, if ever, the case. Facts, as John Adams still tells us, are stubborn things. My introduction to learning the facts came in 1955. I was 4 years old, and like many a baby boomer, had recently fallen in love with Davy Crockett. Actually, Fess Parker, shown here as Davy Crockett. I had the .45 record, the coonskin cap, the toy rifle, the t-shirt, everything. Imagine my surprise on my 4th birthday when I came into the living room to find the Davy Crockett at the Alamo toy fort. My dad had already set up the tin walls, the Alamo building, with the brave Texican defenders inside the walls and Santa Anna's Mexican soldiers outside them. The official Davy Crockett figure was Davy at rest, his long rifle, Old Bessie, cradled in his arms. Well, there was another buckskin, coonskin cap wearing figure swinging his rifle, just like Davy was doing at the end of the Alamo episode. So he, of course, became Davy Crockett. What a great present. One warm spring day, I was on the 2nd floor porch. We lived above my grandparents then, when Eddie, the 7-year-old across the street, asked if he could come up and play. Okay, I replied, you can be the Mexicans. Eddie no sooner sat down when he began picking off Davy's comrades in arms one by one, finally knocking over rifle-swinging Davy from the Alamo roof. He fell 8 inches to his death. What are you doing? I said angrily. Killing Davy Crockett, he replied, not knowing his remark sounded like a future book by Bill O'Reilly. Davy didn't die at the Alamo, I said convincingly, for I had seen Fess Parker, Davy, swinging his rifle butt furiously as the camera faded, the song came back, and the film ended. Yeah, he did too, Eddie replied, calling me a dope for good measure before he headed home. I couldn't wait for my dad to come home that night. Before he even got through the door, I asked, did Davy Crockett die at the Alamo? Yes, he replied. When did this happen? I asked. About 120 years ago, my dad said. This was both news to me and my first foray into history. After all, Davy lived in Tennessee and Texas, where every week the Lone Ranger and Tonto were fighting bank robbers and killers. I thought cars hadn't gotten that far west yet. I thought I was watching newsreel footage of Davy Crockett and his sidekick, Georgie Russell. Meanwhile, my father was looking at me as if I was the dumbest kid in the world. It was Eddie, and not John Adams, who taught me that facts are indeed stubborn things. The following remarks are rooted in far more accurate documentation. James Monroe is the last of the fabled Virginia dynasty and the least well known, to the point of appearing in historical afterthought. All most Americans know about James Monroe is that his last name is on a doctrine, and even that is an enigma to most. At its 100th anniversary in 1823, Historian David Yancey Thomas put it best: "I only know two things about the Monroe Doctrine. One, that no American I have met knows what it is. Two, that no American I have met will consent to it being tampered with." There you have it. This painting was done by Samuel F.B. Morse, who most of us only recall as the inventor of the telegraph. Of all the portraits of Monroe, including Gilbert Stuart's, this is the painting Monroe's family felt captured him best. And for me, they were absolutely right. It's anything but sedate, as portraits often are. Morse captured him perfectly. He almost looks as if he's standing in the wind. Those are eyes that don't miss anything, capable of warmth and stubbornness, an almost hawk-like stare of obvious determination. His jaw firmly set and his lips shut, but with enough of a turn at the corners to break into a grin that would reveal his innate optimism. For most historians, Monroe suffers in comparison to the other members of the Virginia dynasty. He was an officer, but not a general like Washington. He was a politician, but not as charismatic as Jefferson. Although a lawyer, he did not possess Madison's legal brilliance. But his physical courage certainly equaled Washington's. His willingness to adapt and adjust his political tenets allowed him to go beyond Jefferson in political thought, and his willingness to risk both his political career and his life in the bargain for James Madison's administration allowed him to help end a war Monroe had supported from the get-go and willingly learned from its folly. From 1775 to 1825, James Monroe played a role in all the major events of America's first half century. It's a saga about rebellion, the unwieldy birth of a new government, a lifetime love affair with a remarkable woman, the dangers of a European revolution that coupled American ideals with mob rule and the guillotine, the joys, sorrows, and tragedies of parenthood, political intrigue that ranged from heated debate to pistols at 20 paces, diplomatic imbroglios, and unnecessary war, a post-war nation giddy with confidence, and throughout the tale, it is intertwined with slavery and racism. He was a physically imposing man, just over 6 feet, and he stayed lean and fit throughout his life. Like Washington, he was an accomplished horseman. Twice during the War of 1812, he led scouting parties from Washington, D.C. towards the Maryland coast when British warships approached the Chesapeake and the Potomac. Those days of hard riding were hardly in the job description of Secretary of State or easy for a 56-year-old man. He held more public offices and positions than any president before him or since, rising from lieutenant to major in the Continental Army, wounded at Trenton, and serving as an aide to Lord Stirling at Germantown, Brandywine, Valley Forge, and Monmouth, serving as a lieutenant colonel in the Virginia militia, elected to the Virginia General Assembly at 24, to the Confederation Congress at age 25, to the U.S. Senate at 32, served as minister to France and later to Spain and Great Britain, 4 terms as governor of Virginia, Secretary of State, and Secretary of War under James Madison, holding down both positions in the direst moments of the War of 1812. Early in his political career, he showed evidence of astute observation and sound decision-making. Disappointed that he was not selected as a delegate to the Constitutional Convention, Monroe was chosen by Patrick Henry to be among the document's opponents at the Virginia Ratification Convention due to its lacking a Bill of Rights. He was particularly concerned about the responsibility of the president and the articles of impeachment. Would the president be tried by his own counsel, by those who advise him to commit such crises? This, he declared, subverts the principles of justice. What was to prevent a foreign power using what Monroe called their arts and intrigues to corrupt his counselors, if not the president himself? And this is 180 years before Putin and McCartney wrote back in the USSR. The thought that a foreign power could hold such sway over a president haunted Monroe. His decisiveness can best be seen in his first year as governor, when a yellow fever epidemic spread from Norfolk to Fredericksburg in the summer of 1800. Monroe had seen the tragic effect of the disease while a senator in Philadelphia. To stop further spreading, Monroe declared an immediate quarantine of all vessels in Norfolk. Not even a canoe was allowed up the James River, and Monroe ordered that doctors examine everyone aboard the quarantined and arriving ships with the stricken cared for at political or at public expense. He did not rescind his orders until November, only opening the port when doctors assured him the crisis had passed. His relationship with the four presidents who came before him are worth reviewing. Washington admired Monroe for his courage and gave him a battlefield promotion after being seriously wounded at Trenton, and wrote a warm recommendation for him when Monroe asked permission to raise a regiment for the Virginia militia, calling him a brave, active, and sensible officer. But by the time Washington became president, Monroe's skills as a partisan leader had cooled Washington's admiration. When it became obvious that Gouverneur Morris, Washington's minister to France, had worn out his welcome and a new diplomat was needed, the president named Monroe, but only after Madison and New Yorker Robert Livingston turned Washington down. Morris was no Francophile. Monroe was. And Washington needed a Republican minister, as he was sending Federalist John Jay to London to work out a treaty that would surely shock and anger the French, America's first and most important ally. For 3 years, Monroe did his best to fulfill Washington's goal to strengthen our friendship with France, as Washington put it. He succeeded in winning back French favor, but when the Jay Treaty crossed the English Channel, the new French government saw Monroe as either naive or duplicitous. By this time, Washington had lost faith in Monroe, and Monroe had lost faith in Washington. After he was recalled by John Adams, Monroe wrote a long public response to Washington called A View of the Conduct of the Executive. It was a blistering accusation of duplicity by Washington, ignoring the fact that Monroe had also been duplicitous, sending reports to Madison and other Republican allies about the French reaction over Jay's treaty and Monroe's own resentment of his treatment by Washington's and Adams' cabinet members. Monroe nurtured his grudge until he was elected governor of Virginia in December of 1799, when he wrote Madison that he intended to reach out to Washington to see if they could reconcile their differences. Days later, after riding about Mount Vernon during a harsh storm, Washington came inside, soaked and chilled to the bone. He asked his amanuensis, Tobias Lear, to read the newspapers to him. After Lear mentioned Monroe's election to the governorship, Washington became so agitated that Lear suggested he go to bed. Washington died the next day. 23 years had passed since that bitter, snowy night when the young lieutenant crossed the Delaware ahead of his general, both united by the same desire, a country of their own. In the end, partisan politics created a river too icy for either of them to cross. It was President John Adams, not Washington, who recalled Monroe from Paris and later publicly branded Monroe the disgraced minister. In the spring of 1800, Adams informed Governor Monroe of his intention as president to visit Virginia. A presidential visit usually required a personal welcome from the governor. Monroe was not so inclined. Any attention from me to you, he wrote Adams, would be highly improper, and Adams knew why. He did not come to Virginia. 11 years later, a retired and mellowed Adams sent congratulations to Monroe when Madison made him Secretary of State. Monroe responded in kind, wishing Adams all the satisfaction and happiness Adams had merited. But my favorite Adams correspondence is not between James and John, or even John Quincy, Monroe's future Secretary of State. It is between Monroe and Abigail Adams. When the War of 1812 broke out, she and her husband grew concerned they might not live to see their son Quincy, then minister to Russia. Her letter to Secretary of State Monroe, shown here and part of our collection at the Historical Society, asking whether any method of possibility may be devised for him and his family to get back to America with safety during the war, is a wondrous combination of New England pertinence and a mother's heartsick anxiety. And this is my favorite document I've ever come across. Monroe responded with empathetic sincerity. While it is impossible to state the precise time when your son will return, he promised Abigail that every facility which the government can allow will be extended to him. Years later, during Monroe's celebrated tour of the northern United States, he spent a wondrous stay at the Adams farm, Peacefield. Days later, Abigail received a letter telling her that Quincy was sailing home to serve as Monroe's Secretary of State. For nearly 50 years, Thomas Jefferson served as Monroe's mentor, law professor, counselor, and role model. This is my favorite portrait of Thomas Jefferson, and it's by Jamie Wyeth, not quite 40, 50 years ago. Jefferson saw great progress in Monroe. Turn his soul wrong side outwards, and there was not a speck on it, he wrote Madison. Monroe became a willing acolyte, serving Jefferson as a reliable officer and courier during the Revolution, sharing living quarters with him in Annapolis during one congressional session, being his eyes and ears in the Confederation Congress while Jefferson was minister to France, and later returning to France himself at President Jefferson's request to close a real estate deal we call the Louisiana Purchase. Years later, after Washington was burned by the British and Monroe was scrambling to fulfill two cabinet responsibilities, he poured out his troubles to Jefferson, adding his intention to, as he put it, adopt almost any plan to keep the government financially afloat and add manpower to a standing army, an abandonment of the agrarian idealism they both loved. For pragmatic approaches to keep from losing the war, Jefferson warned him that were an angel from heaven to undertake Monroe's challenges, all our miscarriages would be ascribed to you. But Monroe's mind was set. From this point on, he continued to seek Jefferson's opinion, but would not always take it. His relationship with Madison was the longest and in many ways the deepest. They were rivals during the Virginia Convention to ratify the Constitution and are the only two presidents who opposed each other for a congressional seat, once having a debate outside a Presbyterian church during a blizzard because the minister thought politics didn't belong inside a house of worship, an early example of the separation of church and state that resulted in Madison's nose becoming frostbitten. After settling in Virginia, after his daughter Eliza's birth, the Monroes asked Madison, back in New York, to shop for their furniture. Brilliant as he was, the Bachelor Madison was an abject failure with housewares. Elizabeth's sister, Maria, called his purchases vile. As an interior decorator, Madison was one hell of a legislator. Years later, when the Monroes were in Paris and Madison had married Dolly, he made the same request, not so slyly suggesting that Elizabeth make the purchases. As with Washington, Monroe had a falling out with both Jefferson and Madison. After the Louisiana Purchase, Monroe led negotiations in London for a treaty that would improve relations with the British and unofficially, hopefully, end the impressment of American sailors on the high seas. But both President Jefferson and Secretary of State Madison would not even present the treaty to Congress. Monroe's resentment of Jefferson soon subsided. Who could stay angry with Jefferson? But he remained embittered at Madison. They did not communicate for 2 years until Madison, now president, wrote Monroe asking him to recommend a gardener for Montpelier, accompanied by his and Dolly's best wishes to Elizabeth. The ice was broken, and within months, Monroe became Madison's Secretary of State. Leave it to the shy and sly Madison to replant a friendship with a letter requesting a gardener. A favorite story of mine occurred about years later when both men were ex-presidents. Jefferson had recently died, and both were now on the University of Virginia's Board of Governors. One observer delighted in watching these two old friends and rivals indulge in the humorous jest and merry laugh as if young again. After one session, they took a break to walk their old friend's estate. Somewhere, somehow, Madison lost his shoe buckles on some muddy embankment. Once back home, Monroe sent Madison the buckles to repair the loss you sustained in our interesting walk at Monticello. Boys will be boys, and when given the opportunity, old men will be boys too. As a young man, Monroe possessed what Jefferson called an excessive inflammability of temper. He came perilously close to fighting a duel with Alexander Hamilton. In the last days of his presidency, he brandished fireplace tongs to defend himself against his cane-wielding Treasury Secretary, William Crawford. Monroe had a keen intellect, but when your two best friends are Jefferson and Madison, you have no chance whatsoever of being thought the brightest in the room. But Monroe was wise, wiser than both of them. Once when these three were at Monticello, another guest summed up their talents quite accurately. Jefferson, he declared, has the most learning, Madison, the most brilliancy, and Monroe, the best judgment. But it is Monroe's working relationship with John Quincy Adams that best shows us Monroe's foresight and leadership skills. At cabinet meetings, Monroe kept separate sheets of paper for each issue he wanted to discuss. Adams called them Monroe's Sibylline leaves. In fact, Monroe's cabinet rivals Washington's or any other president's for talent. Among those at the table were Secretary of Treasury William Crawford, whose financial skills were sound, although Crawford's loyalty was to Crawford and not his president. Young John Calhoun, Secretary of War, not yet slavery's avatar. His organizational skills came in handy in reorganizing the Army. And Adams, who had been a U.S. diplomat since his teenage years. Monroe spent most of the time picking his team's brains, asking questions, and rarely giving his opinions until the sessions were well underway. Adams at first thought this revealed a slowness and want of decision in Monroe, but soon admitted in his diary that he was wrong. Quincy Adams soon developed profound respect for Monroe's always deliberate and always sincere decisions. But it was Calhoun who best summed up Monroe's approach. "Give him time," Calhoun remarked, "and he was a man of the best judgment I have ever known." The most surprising feature of Monroe's political life comes when he assumes the presidency. In the House and Senate, Monroe was the most partisan of politicians. Even the Federalists admired his infighting skills. Had he been a politician today, he would be nightly on MSNBC or Fox, depending on the issue. At times, he was more of a Jeffersonian than, well, Jefferson. Once president, however, Monroe abandoned his party biases. Washington's death robbed him from a rapprochement with his commander-in-chief, but now Monroe became a spiritual role model. He assimilated Federalist ideas, such as a national bank, if not Federalist leaders. And, like Washington, he knew the importance of imagery. On his extensive tours of the United States, the first by a president since Washington, he wore a blue jacket with buff waistcoat and breeches, along with a chapeau bras hat. It was the closest Monroe could get to the continental uniform he wore proudly 40 years earlier. In great cities, small towns, and quaint villages, his arrivals guaranteed bands, military honors, and fireworks. At times, silhouetted against the late afternoon sun, he reminded citizens of their husband, father, brother, or comrade in arms. Monroe's outfit was no accident, and it was a Federalist newspaper, Boston's Columbian Sentinel, that gave his presidency the nickname still used today, the era of good feelings. Monroe had easily defeated Federalist Rufus King in 1816. Despite the panic of 1819, which rivals the Great Depression for its economic impact on the United States, and the very real threat of secession regarding the admission of Missouri to the Union before the famous compromise was reached, and in which Monroe played a not-so-secret role in resolving with political skills similar to FDR's or Lyndon Johnson's the issue. But Monroe ran virtually unopposed in 1820, winning every electoral vote but one that year. Legend has it that one voter believed that only Washington deserved a unanimous electoral vote. But the truth is that William Plumer of New Hampshire believed Monroe lacked weight of character and cast his vote for Quincy Adams. In his 8 years as president, Monroe had his share of accomplishments, among them the acquisition of Florida, increasing the strength of the Army and Navy, and building more forts to deter another invasion like the War of 1812. His hopes of building interstate roadways and canals were hampered by his own interpretation of the Constitution and Congress's refusal to amend it. But his principal shortcomings came from the country's most vexing issue, that of race. From his early days as a Confederation congressman, Monroe sought a successful policy of peaceful coexistence with the Native American nations. On one journey through the Northwest Territory that he undertook in 1784, he befriended Joseph Brant, the Mohawk chief who led his warriors with the British against the Americans from New York to Detroit. Brant now sought a fair deal for his people with the Americans, and he and Monroe immediately struck up a friendship. Weeks later, when negotiations with other congressmen broke down, a frustrated Brant wrote Monroe, "The Mohawks," he declared, "wore no double faces at war or at any other business." Monroe urged Brant to come to Congress and state his case, promising him he would be treated fairly. As he wrote this, another treaty was made without Brant or Monroe's involvement, where other Native American leaders ceded New York and much of Ohio to the American government for white settlement, the very lands Brant was trying to save. Throughout his career, including his presidency, Monroe advocated the benign approach of education and assimilation. He delighted in visiting the mostly faith-based schools on Native American lands, believing education was the best solution for a peaceful relationship between the two races. No tribe adapted to his urgings more willingly than the Cherokee, and when Georgia's governor and congressman demanded that Monroe separate their plans and support the plans to relocate the tribe out of Virginia, he defied them. An attempt to remove the Cherokee would, in my opinion, be unjust, he stated. But Monroe could neither move the Cherokee nor protect them. John Quincy Adams maintained Monroe's unwieldy balancing act. Andrew Jackson did otherwise. 12 of the first 14 presidents were slaveholders. Only John and John Quincy Adams were not. Monroe considered himself a benign master, writing and speaking about the evils of slavery. One of his purchases was from Jefferson, Sally Hemings' sister, Thania. When she died, the Monroes mourned her loss. As president, Monroe enthusiastically sent the United States Navy to the Atlantic and Caribbean to hunt down slavers and slave trading ships, and proudly mentioned the Navy's successes in his annual messages to Congress, what we call the State of a Union address. He was a founding member of the American Colonization Society and was honored that they named Liberia's capital, Monrovia, after him. He once took a relative of Jefferson's to court over the beating of an enslaved man, stating that the God who made us made the Black people, and they ought not to be treated with barbarity. As governor of Virginia, he was compelled to execute the leaders of Gabriel's rebellion, which prompted serious soul-searching on Monroe's part, hanging rebellious enslaved men for doing exactly what he had done 25 years earlier, fight for his liberty, aided Monroe. Where to arrest the hand of the executioner, he asked Jefferson. For the rest of his life, Monroe sought a solution to slavery that was morally, politically, and financially agreeable to him. He never found it. Given his point of view and the times he lived in, he never could have. Monroe did free one enslaved man just before his death. That man, Peter Marks, was an enslaved man Monroe owned for years. And this and the following document are the two that were recently discovered at the Historical Society of Pennsylvania by very erstwhile researchers at Monticello. That man, Peter Marks, whose wife Eugenia was the niece of Thania and Sally Hemings, was freed on Monroe's deathbed, ironically on the 4th of July. This is the certification that Monroe's son-in-law, Samuel Gouverneur, testified in 1832 to guarantee Peter's freedom. If you asked Monroe which of his many titles was dearest to his heart, he would have said husband and father. He and his wife had 3 children, 2 daughters, Eliza shown here, and Mariah, and a son, James, who died when he was 1 year old during Gabriel's rebellion. The oldest, Eliza, accompanied her parents to Paris in 1794 and was educated by Madame Jean-Louise Henriette Campan, a former lady-in-waiting for Marie Antoinette, who was probably spared the guillotine because she was Citizen Genet's sister. Madame Campan taught both schooling and aristocratic behavior. Eliza took to both eagerly and soon became what we now call a snob. At Madame's school, she met her lifelong friend, Hortense de Beauharnais, whose mother, Josephine, was mistress to a young, ambitious officer, Napoleon Bonaparte. As an adult, Eliza's innate talent for putting on airs did little to warm Washington society to her and often caused angst with her parents. No reputation, John Quincy Adams believed, is safe in her hands. Yet she was capable of exceptional kindnesses. When the infant daughter of John C. Calhoun was deathly ill, Eliza visited every day, just one example of her well-hidden better side. One DC socialite commented that Eliza was the best nurse in the world. Her husband, attorney George Hay, became one of her father's closest advisors. The youngest daughter, Mariah, was a playful child, much more endearing than her sister. Her marriage to her cousin Samuel Gouverneur was the first White House wedding, which, thanks to Eliza, caused a storm of controversy when Eliza considerably restricted the guest list. Sam Gouverneur lacked his brother-in-law's influence with the president, but Monroe found him a reliable assistant. While serving in Congress in New York City in 1785, Monroe met Elizabeth Courtright. Hers was one of the most prominent families in both New York's business and society circles. Elizabeth and her 3 sisters rivaled the Schuyler sisters in popularity, looks, and education, and would be equally well known had Lin-Manuel Miranda made Monroe his subject and not Hamilton. One congressman recalled the Courtright sisters making such a brilliant and lovely an appearance at a theater one night as to depopulate all the other boxes of all the genteel male people therein. To Monroe's friends, Elizabeth resembled a young goddess, and it's easy to see why. Throughout his youth, Monroe had pursued the ladies with a shy earnestness that often led to disappointing results. In fact, Elizabeth's friends considered the land-poor Monroe as beneath her. They were married at her stately home called the Sycamore on Wall Street in February 1786. James was 27, Elizabeth 17. She bore the role of a politician's wife with exceptional dignity and class. Here's 3 stories I love about her. The first occurred when Elizabeth was expecting their first child. Congress had just adjourned, and Monroe had bought a chariot, a 2-horse carriage with a coach box for Monroe to sit in as he drove the 2 horses and a cushioned back seat for no more than 2 passengers. To keep her company, Bachelor James Madison hitched a ride. Madison's voice was so small as he was, but his conversations were almost totally about politics, as he and Monroe shouted over the clip-clop of horses' hooves about this issue or that colleague. Elizabeth gamefully bore these endless rides over rutted dirt roads and the bare bones amenities of roadside taverns and inns, hardly a match for the comfort of her home. No one was more grateful when Monroe turned up the road to Mount Vernon to pay a respectful visit to George Washington, who had a well-deserved reputation as a gracious host. He immediately saw to it that Elizabeth received every creature comfort she needed, particularly a bath, a fine meal, a comfortable bed, and privacy. Another incident came in 1824, the last full year of Monroe's presidency. By this time, Elizabeth had long suffered from seizures and illnesses. Her oldest daughter, Eliza, often substituted for her during formal affairs. The era of good feelings was now ancient history, as no less than 5 serious presidential candidates arose, 3 from Monroe's cabinet. Various congressional supporters, particularly William Crawford's, looked for any chance to embarrass Monroe, launching investigations into both his political appointments and his finances. A major cultural event was to be held in April. The First Unitarian Church was hosting an oratorio. All of Washington society would attend. Gossip mongers assumed the Monroes would not. They did, coming as much to silence wagging tongues as to hear the performances. Though seriously ill, Elizabeth Monroe had lost neither her dignity nor her steely resolve. Her courage was best shown in Paris when she was all of 25 years old. Among the imprisoned during the Reign of Terror when the Monroes arrived in 1794 was Adrienne Lafayette, wife of Monroe's old war comrade, the Marquis, himself languishing in an Austrian prison. Adrienne's mother, grandmother, and sister were all beheaded by Robespierre 5 days before he himself met Madame Guillotine, and 3 days before the Monroes arrived in France. Because there were more prisoners than cells, Adrienne was incarcerated at the 400-year-old Plessis prison, once a stately hotel. As minister, Monroe was confined by diplomatic encumbrances that prevented any direct action on his part. But if her husband could not visit Adrienne, Elizabeth would. One late autumn morning, wearing one of her finer dresses, topped with a warm cloak to offset the morning chill, she climbed into their carriage, cleaned and polished, and had herself driven the 1.5 miles from their home to Plessis prison, passing the expensive estates and then the narrow Parisian streets lined with tenements, wine and barber shops, and an occasional brothel. Meanwhile, her husband worriedly paced the floors at their homes. When the coachman stopped at the prison entrance, a crowd converged, and Elizabeth stepped out and walked straight to the gate, announcing who she was and the reason for her visit. Hearing the jailer's boots come up the stairs, Adrienne panicked, believing the executioner had come for her at last. Instead, there was a tearful, heartwarming meeting between the two women, the start of the Monroes campaign to successfully have Adrienne freed. Finally, a word on the Monroe Doctrine. Monroe was known for taking his time in resolving an issue. When it came to the recognition of the new republics in South America, spearheaded by Simon Bolivar, Bernardo O'Higgins, and others, Monroe was chastised by Speaker of the House Henry Clay for his lack of action. But as always for Monroe, it was a matter of timing. And by 1823, he believed the moment was at hand. His declaration that European powers could no longer establish colonies in the Western Hemisphere was both a sign of the growing strength of the United States and the knowledge that the British Navy, then the most powerful instrument of might in the world, would back America up. Scholars have long debated whether the Monroe Doctrine was his idea or that of John Quincy Adams. It is actually the perfect union of their ideas as well as another's. As historian and Monroe expert Scott Harris says, George Washington was not in the room where the Monroe Doctrine happened, but his policy of neutrality was certainly a strong influence. 2 centuries later, the Monroe Doctrine can be seen as the third document from the founders that states American ideals for its government and citizens to live by. Jefferson's comment about it says it best. This, he said to Monroe, sets our compass. The man who had fought for and served his country on 2 continents died in a small bedroom at his daughter Mariah's New York home on the 4th of July, 1831. All of America mourned. His funeral was the largest yet seen in New York. Of all the eulogies and tributes, the best came from John Quincy Adams. If any parent has a child of ardent mind and panting for honorable distinction, Adams' solution was simple. Point him, he said, to James Monroe. Thank you very much.
Great. Thank you, Tim. That was really great. And I did want to, we do have some questions, but I did want to say that the book is fantastic. I'm not finished yet, but I'm enjoying it very much, and it's available at at all the major online retailers, Amazon and Barnes and Noble and Walmart, and so I would highly recommend it because it is very, very interesting.
Chris, check is in the mail.
Well, and one of the things that I know that, I am familiar with the time period, but one of the things that I think people will, that really comes out in the book, that I think people may find a little bit comforting in a way, is that politics, partisan politics in particular, and politics have always kind of been, there was no harmonious feeling among politicians, even at the beginning of the founding of the country, and a lot of that political discourse and back and forth, especially in the newspapers, and politicians going back and forth with each other 250 years ago or more, that always existed. And so because you hear today, how politics is so partisan, and there's a lot of violent vitriol, but there was always some of that. Maybe today with social media and everything, you get a little bit more of it, but I think the book really also does a really good job of illustrating that not all the founding fathers were this one big harmonious voice, that everybody knew exactly what we wanted, and it was one big one big vision that they all had. There was a lot of discourse and a lot of debate. So and I think the book does a really good job in illustrating that.
Yeah, thank you.
So we do have a question from Robert. He had a question about the duel. He says, "What was the almost duel with Hamilton about?"
That's a good question, Robert, and thanks for posing it. Monroe was in the Senate at the time, and there was this was in 1792. He and Congressman Venable from Virginia, and Pennsylvania Congressman, visited Hamilton at his offices as a courtesy to let him know that Congress was going to be investigating his handling of the Treasury and any misprision of funds. And Hamilton simply said, "Well, I don't want to talk about it here. My family is up in New York. Come visit me at home this evening." So the 3 gentlemen did. And they sat down and were totally shocked at what Hamilton told them, that they had said, "You're running around with this Reynolds character who everybody knows as a scalawag." And Hamilton said, "Yes, I am seeing him, but the reason I'm not using federal funds to give him for any speculation, I am paying him out of my own pocket blackmail because I'm having an affair with his wife." And all 3 said, "Well, that's nobody else's business. That's a private affair." And Hamilton thanked them for that. Monroe wrote him a letter saying that he had the documents that had been sent, but that there wasn't going to be any pursuit about this. Monroe sent copies, before he went to France, about the interview, probably to Jefferson. And while Monroe was in France, a fellow, James Callender, who was basically the Drudge Report of the colonial era, had gotten the documents and published them. It's pretty well proven now that he did not get them from Jefferson, so Monroe wasn't even the secondary source, but from the Secretary Beckley of Congress, who was a gentleman who absolutely, as my eighth grade nun would say, abhorred, eschewed, and abominated Hamilton. And it was he who gave the documents. When Monroe returned years later in 1797, as Adams put it, the disgraced minister, when he and his wife visited her family in New York, and Hamilton down the street heard about that, he immediately sent a notice to Monroe, his intention to visit Monroe, and that he was bringing a friend, and Monroe should have a friend with him. This is the opening of what the Code Duello is as to how one fights a duel. You know, you start with having witnesses. So Hamilton upbraided Monroe for his releasing, you know, the information that he said he would not. And Monroe very calmly said he did not do that. He had sent his documents to a friend in Virginia, but he had nothing to do with that being shared. And finally, Hamilton said, "You're nothing but a scoundrel," at which point both men stood up, and Monroe, being 6 foot, looking down at the 5'7" or so Hamilton, and basically, where are we going to do with this? Pistols, swords, or fists? And they started to make arrangements to fight this duel. So their seconds would get involved. Hamilton's second visiting Monroe in New York, and then when he was back in Philadelphia with Congress, he was convinced that Monroe did not do this and told Hamilton that. In the meantime, Monroe's second, who, like Monroe and Hamilton, had been an officer in the Continental Army, was trying to work out some kind of a ceasefire between the two of them, basically saying, you guys are both officers, you're both crack shots, you're going to kill each other, and the country can't afford to lose you. And again, in the Historical Society of Pennsylvania, there is the letter from this gentleman to James Monroe saying, basically, Alex will say no harm, no foul, if you will. And Monroe agrees. And of course, it being American history, Monroe's second that puts an end to this duel is Aaron Burr.
Bonnie has a question. How does Monroe's current ranking in presidential effectiveness match up to what you think he deserves?
That's another good question. And thank you, Bonnie. And thanks for being here tonight. If you go back through all of the presidential rankings, which started with Arthur Schlesinger Sr., up to and including the CNN ones, the one was just done, I think, right before the 4th of July, Monroe has been ranked anywhere from 7th to 18th. He's usually around 11th or 12th, and I think he's one of those two numbers in the most recent one. He moved back one space to make room for Barack Obama. In terms of his presidency, I think that's probably accurate. He didn't get everything done that he wanted to do, especially the issue of building more roads and canals and making it easier, not just for commerce, but for people to move westward and settle the new territories that were becoming states. And I think the other problem with that is that he was not someone that tooted his own horn very much. If there's a 20th century or if there's a contemporary president that he's a lot alike, it's George H.W. Bush. You do your job and you don't brag about it. And he did that very well. He rarely talked about his accomplishments. And I think that might have hurt him a bit. There was one other thing. There was I forget the name of the group, but it's like a group of psychologists. I don't think it was Psychology Today, but several years ago, ranked presidents according to their narcissistic talents. And Monroe was ranked next to last I wish I could remember who last was, because I don't know. Maybe it was George H.W. Bush, of anybody that had lesser need for their ego to be massaged than Monroe, which certainly hasn't been the case recently, with one recent ex-president. He was very ambitious. He wanted to be president. He wanted to move forward, but at the same time, it was just as much ego as it was service. He never stopped serving the country.
Great, thank you. And Jim has a similar question, and maybe he says, where would you rate Monroe among the top 10 presidents? So maybe also, talk about maybe the first 10 presidents, where his kind of politics fell in there.
Well, that's a good question. I'm wondering which Jim it is. I might have an idea. If it's Jim Hilty, he's playing with me because he's the guy who got me into the books. He's been a figure at the Historical Society, but he was a professor, taught history at Temple for decades, and there was never a better teacher. If my memory serves me well, the usual retinue of the top 5 or 6 is Lincoln, Washington, FDR, Teddy Roosevelt, Truman, Jefferson. Eisenhower's now in the top 10, which is well deserved. And Kennedy and Reagan make it. And while some might think that President Kennedy shouldn't be ranked that high, I think for the way he handled the Cuban Missile Crisis is the reason why we're all here talking about this. I think that I think Monroe is aptly in the right spot, and I also don't think that he's going to get much higher. Washington and Jefferson are in the top 10, but there's no other, as I can think. Polk for a while was in what they called the near great category, and Jackson was always in the top 10. And I think that their status has fallen as we start including the whole American story, which is both pertinent, relevant, and the right thing to do. The 1619 Project is not trying to change, the facts of history or the facts of our history so much as it is to include a significant population of Americans left by their color and by their social rank, I'm sure, over time. And I think as we learn more about that, we get a better appreciation of what kind of a country we are. So I don't see him moving higher, but I think he certainly did well enough. He also created the modern presidency in some ways. He realized, I think before anyone else, that the presidency was not given the respect or the impact until he ascended to it. Nicholas Spittle, who had been his secretary in France and then became a very prominent historical figure. And again, it's another HSP letter where he tells Monroe how excited he is about taking on the first of his 3 tours, because most Americans think of the president as the chief clerk of Congress. And Monroe certainly dispelled that notion. And I think he made Americans come to the realization that the man in the White House is the person that we are going to reward or blame for whatever's going on during their presidencies.
Great, thank you. And then we have a question. I'm not sure who it is. It's an email address, S. Eikenberry. But they say, why was Monroe called, quote, the last of the cocked hats, unquote?
That's a good question from Mr. or Ms. or Dr. Eikenberry, and thank you. He comes at the end of he's either described as the last founding father or as the first of the post-founders presidencies. In a way, he straddles both. He's certainly is much younger than his predecessors. I think there's like a 7-year difference between him and Madison, but the others are considerably older. But the other side of the coin is that, his dress was an anachronism. He still wore the knee breeches and the buckled shoes long when they'd come out of fashion. And then, as we said earlier, when he went on these tours, he was finding the best thing he could that would look like a Continental Army uniform. So he understood the importance of image. But I think he gets that title mainly because following him is John Quincy Adams. And culturally, you've gone from the last cocked hat to a president who we now know was very fond of skinny dipping in the Potomac. So little subtle change there.
Right. Okay, great. Well, I think that's all the questions we have from the audience. So again, I want to thank you, Tim, for being with us tonight. I want to thank everybody for coming out with us tonight. And I do highly recommend reading the book James Monroe, A Life, and I'm thoroughly enjoying it. It's a really interesting book and very well written.